So the session today is on financial management for CED organizations, an insider's guide to financial management for sustainability. It's brought to you by CEDNet, a national network of local organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. If you like the session today, consider becoming a member or signing up for our free e-newsletters. I'll provide more information on that later on. This session is part of a new webinar series that CEDNet's has launched this fall that is offering monthly sessions over the next year on topics such as the versatility of co-ops, the resilience imperative, charitable status for CED, and others. But it also builds on the long experience of CEDNet's International Committee, which has organized previous sessions over the past couple of years on topics like community forestry in BC and Nepal, the co-construction of public policy for the social and solidarity economy in Mali and around the world, or the impacts of fair trade, or successful strategies for community tourism. All of these past sessions are on our website, and we'll provide links to them in a follow-up email. The session today is divided into two parts. The first part is a presentation and conversation I'll have with Walter Hossli. That'll last for about 30 minutes, and then it'll be your turn. We'll have 25 minutes for a question and answer period. Financial management of CED organizations. Funding, as you all know as well as I do, funding's always been a challenge for CED organizations. The work we do is an investment, helping people move towards greater self-sufficiency and participation in society. But our work also crosses a wide range of topics, of departments, of responsibilities across governments, and can sometimes be difficult to determine a quantifiable value. There have been a small number of pioneering CED organizations in the country that have been able to grow and succeed in this environment. Groups like New Dawn Enterprises in Cape Breton, Réseau in Montreal, CED in Winnipeg, Quint Community Development Corporation in Saskatoon, and Momentum in Calgary. For all of these groups to grow and succeed in their work, they've had to find ways of securing the resources required to respond to both the community needs and also to seize opportunities as they arise. Momentum's experience is very instructive for groups who are facing challenges with funding, so I'm really happy that Walter's agreed to do this session with us today. Before we get to the presentation, though, it's helpful to get a sense of who's on the call. So let's do a quick poll of participants. You should see this poll just popped up on your screen here, and you have a number of choices about your responsibilities related to financial management. Are you the ED of a community organization, financial manager of one, a funder, someone who really just likes numbers, or another? If you pick another category there, please, you can perhaps identify in the chat box what your relationship is to financial management. That'll help us get a better sense of who's on the call. So while people answer, let me introduce our guest. Walter's been the Executive Director of Momentum since it was founded in 1991. Under his leadership, Momentum has won the Community Achievement Award from the City of Calgary, been recognized by Tides Canada Foundation and by Charity Intelligence as one of the most effective organizations in Calgary, and also named one of Alberta's top 50 employers. Walter's a founding board member of CEDNet, and he helped establish Vibrant Communities Calgary, an organization dedicated to fighting poverty. Thanks for joining us today, Walter.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Good. So before I hand it over to you, let's just have a quick look at our poll results. It's a pretty good split, actually. A few EDs and financial managers, one funder, a couple of people who like numbers, and a few others. I see we have a member of the board of directors. That's a valuable role. And network project managers, Seth from the ED, and the government rep. So it's a really good mix. That gives us a helpful sense of who's participating today. So, Walter, by way of a starting point, can you tell people perhaps what they're gonna take away from the session today, and an overview of what you're gonna cover?
Yeah, I'll I'll cover 3 areas, or I would like to have all of you leave with 3 things. One, I want to give everyone a sense of the big picture of financial concepts in the nonprofit organization, in general. I'm speaking from the perspective of an incorporated charity. My hope is that we can start breaking down also, secondly, the taboos of organizational finances in our sector. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. I have never been to a conference, CED or otherwise, where we openly talk amongst ourselves about our own struggles and challenges with finances. Yet we always talk about funders, especially how difficult they make life for us. Sorry for to those folks that are funders. But that's often our sense that we have when we talk to each other at conferences.
Yep.
Thirdly, I would like all of you to feel a greater sense of control at the end of this, of your own organization's financial destiny and where you want to go. So I want to get started. I'll give you some personal background, a bit about myself. Then I want to talk briefly about the business model that is common in our sector as a whole, on a broad, in a broad sense. Then I want to name the key challenges that we face, the goals of where we need to get to as organizations in order to be more financially stable. And then I want to end on some practical advice on how we can get there.
That sounds good. Okay, so why don't we start with a bit of background about yourself and Momentum, which I guess has a similar path over the last 20 years.
So here's who I am in very brief. I've been the executive director of Momentum for the past 21 years. I'm a so-called founder executive director, which means I've been here from the start and I've played a big role in establishing Momentum. What you see there on the slide is our mission and our high-level numbers. We do most of our work in Calgary and support a couple of loan programs in Edmonton and Saskatoon. And I want to add, the Momentum examples that I use are, of course, our experience, and they may not be exactly the same for you. We live in a big country that has many different approaches in different regions. So forgive me if I generalize a bit too easily.
Okay, so what's the big lesson that you've learned over those 20 years?
So I'll give you my secret, frankly. It all comes down to money. My operating paradigm, therefore, is that we have the best accountant and accounting staff that we can find with the money that we have available. Secondly, we constantly watch our numbers. We know what our work costs. We also make a practice out of asking business people on the board and put them on the finance committee. We require, this is kind of in a bracket, we require that all new board members join a committee for at least a year before they can join the board. That, I believe, is key that, to help board members understand finances of the organization. Then we find ways to make money, and I mean that in a business sense, trying to have a surplus at the end. We don't feel bad or guilty for achieving a surplus. I find that's quite common in our sector, that people feel somehow we shouldn't be making any money. I believe that a small surplus of, let's say, to pick a number, of less than 10% is in fact key to organizational stability in the current environment, and ultimately, therefore, to strong organizational performance. So here's the goal that I see for our times currently that we are facing. We need to bring in enough money to have highly competent staff in order to successfully pursue our mission. We recognize that the big money comes from government. As much as we often talk about the corporate sector and foundations and other sectors, our sector is primarily financed from governments. Therefore, we need to find ways to make a profit or surplus with government contracts. Most of our, I'm assuming most of our money comes in most of the organizations that are listening in today through government contracts, and in fact not government grants. Or at the very least, we need to break even.
That's a bit of a revolutionary approach, I think, when you say making a profit on government contracts. I think a lot of ears probably perked up when they heard that.
Well, that would be great. One thing I set myself as a goal is that we keep this interactive enough to the point that people actually turn off their email and pay 100% attention, because this is really, really important stuff. And I've talked to many EDs that are stressed out about their finances. So whatever we can do, you and I, Mike, today in increasing that is great. So first, I want to draw a line between accounting and finance. Generally, I see accounting as being all about recording of financial data correctly. It's very important in accounting that the data is correct. So therefore, in accounting, there's a right way and there's a wrong way. The outcome of a good accounting system at the end of the year is a clean audit. That's what we strive towards in accounting. Finance, on the other hand, is all about achieving your money, with your money, what needs to be done. The outcome of that is a successful organization that makes a measurable difference within its mission. So in order for that to happen, I believe we need to make accounting data available in a more accessible form. That's kind of what that little picture at the top is showing. This can happen if, and I have 4 conditions here based on my experience, accountants speak a simpler language that everybody can understand and use terms that are commonly known. Secondly, they increasingly present data in forms of charts. Thirdly, they have the discipline to track the trends in line with our strategic plans. So there's 2 things there. Tracking trends means you have to keep track of numbers year over year, and then create a chart on those kinds of priorities that your strategy wants to move you, where you want to make a difference, where you want to move the needle, as it were. Fourthly, take on a greater future orientation than they often do. This is for accounting folks. I believe that many, because of the fact that accounting is about recording past numbers in years, in things that have been spent, we spend too little time looking at the future.
So it sounds like, yeah, accounting is a tool for finance, and it's the finance that can, a healthy approach to finance that can contribute to a successful organization?
Exactly. So here, let me give you the business model of how this works in our sector as a whole. And I mean sector here in the broadest sense, in the nonprofit world. Here is the 3-legged stool, as it were, of nonprofit sustainability. And I have to tell you, I want to give credit to the La Piana group in California for putting this together. This has really meant a lot to me to get this in this form. This very much confirms my overall experience over the years. First, you start with the mission. The mission is all about who you are and what you do. So we do CED. The second thing then that happens is that mission gets turned into or converted into programs. We start to think about, okay, based on this mission, what kind of programs are we going to do? That's all about how we are going to do it. Thirdly then, we need to go to find the money in order to finance those programs. It's pretty simple often. If you don't get the revenue, the program usually dies. So that's the 3 things and how they happen. And then what happens is after you get the revenue, you go back for that program you've designed, you go back to the mission and develop more programs and so on. And you keep going around this circle.
You make it sound so easy. It never seems that easy in practice, or at least when I'm involved with it.
Right, and it isn't, absolutely. So this is where I have our key challenges here. And this is where the 3-legged stool by itself becomes concrete. We are at a time when the reality of the 90s has really caught up with us, where there is very little undesignated funding available now. Most of our money is tied to very specific purposes that the governments want to achieve or that foundations or other funders want to finance. Secondly, we have no core funding, practically no core funding, which means you have to find your own way of financing your lease, paying for your rent, and so forth. Thirdly, there is constant public pressure to keep administrative costs low. And here I'm again speaking very specifically from the perspective of a charity. Charities are constantly asked, so how much do you spend on administration? Then we're faced with having to explain why we have expensive operations, for example, in order to maintain a high repayment rate on our loan fund. And then fourthly, probably one of the biggest challenges that we face is that we have this ever-increasing competition for dollars. We go up against so many of our colleagues in trying to secure, or other organizations in the community, in trying to secure our financial future.
Yeah, that sounds a bit more like daily practice of many CEDNet members. Already, you can see Martin in the chat room is perked up around the question around making a profit on government contracts. But so finance, as you described it, Walter, can be used as a strategy to overcome some of these four challenges?
Absolutely. So here is what I see. Now let's go back to the accounting side of finances, so where we keep track of the numbers versus doing the trends and the charts. Here are the objectives that I see, and sorry, I need to switch the slide here. First, we need to cost our programs properly. We need to know what things cost. A ratio that we use is that if you simply, from an ED's perspective, if you want to know how much a program costs the organization, the ratio that we've used for years is you double the amount of money that the staff gets paid. So if a staff person gets $50,000, you're going to need $100,000 in order to break even, or to be able to get to a point where we're talking here, that you're not losing money. So that's the first thing. We need to cost properly. Secondly, we need to plan for surpluses. We can't just leave it up to chance. We need to budget, just like business does, and I'll go into that a little bit more in detail later. I want to say here right away, and in answer to the question that's already popped up, how can you do that with government dollars? I recognize that this can't be done overnight. So I'm not suggesting for a minute here that this is easy or quick. And this is for the long haul, absolutely. But it starts somewhere. So my point here of putting in a picture with beautiful flowers is it's a bit like gardening in the prairies. Some of you will know that Calgary is at 1,200 meters, has about a 4-month or less growing season. So you're likely not going to get a perfect garden in the first year. And I know this from personal experience. I've been gardening for 30 years. So it takes a lot of thinking ahead, planning, and then nature has to cooperate as well. So it's not all in your control. But if you do it right, and if you persist, you'll get some great results, like these lovely lilies here that I took a picture of.
Very nice. Okay, so the first step is calculating your costs. That seems like that should be easy.
Yes and no, exactly. That's the crux of the matter. I think often this is where we can really learn a lesson from the private sector. And some of you have businesses that operate on the side, so you will know all this already. So here's how the for-profit sector does it on a, given a cup of coffee. How do you figure out how much your sale price should be? Well, here's the formula. Pay attention to the last two items there. Before the before the total number comes up. There's G&A, which is general and administration. So in our case, we call that administration. And then there's an operating profit before you come to total the cost at $249. Consequently, what happens if you price things this way, and if you ask for that kind of money when you sell a cup of coffee, what happens if you sell a cup of coffee, you make 30. If you sell 10, you make $30, and if you sell however many, with the more you sell, the more money you make. It's pretty straightforward. On the other hand, here's what we often do. We don't pay enough attention to the last two items there. G&A and operating profit. Often we underestimate what our G&A costs. Sometimes we simply don't know or don't take the time to add it all up. And secondly, we are too shy to think ahead and actually plan for an operating profit. So then we end up selling the cup of coffee for $2 instead of $2.50. And so this is what happens here on the next slide. The more we sell, the more money we lose. So with one project that we go in the hole, we go a little bit in the hole, and we fundraise for that. But the more we do, or in other words, the harder we work, the more times we go around that that circle that I talked about earlier with the three-legged stool, the greater the hole gets. So the consequence is that the organizations have to fundraise just to keep the projects running and keep the doors open. But we want to get to a point of keeping a surplus at the end of the year. Remember, that was our goal in this. That's where I promised you I would get to in this session. So here are some practical implications for budgeting. At Momentum, we've had a policy to add 15% administration fee, or our G&A, for any project to cover core operating. We add, therefore, a line item. We also, secondly, sorry, I need to be clear here. So we add 15% admin fee as a G&A. Secondly, we add a line item for surplus whenever we can. For example, when we bid on a government contract and we go in with a total. This does not work with all funders, I realize, but you need to at least try. Remember the bigger goal, organizational stability and sustainability.
And you've been able to do this with Momentum.
We have succeeded in creating substantial surpluses to be able to have some reserves over the 21 years that I've been here. And we started really by starting with a full cost proposal. So as I said, we charged that admin fee. I'll give you a very concrete example. Our very first government contract was for $450,000 for 2 trades training streams. We made a strong case to the federal government asking for 15% administrative fee, and we received it based on our rationale of what it would pay for, which turned out to be key in our story. In fact, it really helped us to not simply lose the entire program after about a year, because at that point, all you could get is 52-week contracts. Secondly, we self-generate some revenue. For example, we put our reserves into investments and endowment. We have some endowment income. And that creates some flexible income for us as well. Other organizations charge fees. Our sector overall recovers quite a remarkable amount of money from charging fees for work that they either do with the people in the community or for other work that they may do in the sector as a whole. Thirdly, we defer underspent dollars wherever possible. Some of you know the word slippage. If we don't use all the money that's in the contract, some of the contracts are so restrictive. If you don't use it, you lose it. So it is really important that in those cases that you pay close attention to where you're at in the contract. And if you find that there's really no useful way of spending all the dollars, at least ask if you can defer them into the next year and figure out a way of then using them toward the same purpose. Often we found that to work with government contracts as well. And then fourthly, that's probably the biggest single risk management approach to finances. You have to diversify your income streams. If you're sitting at 2 or 3 income streams, you're very vulnerable if one of those organizations pulls their plug. We have done this for 20 years, and as you saw at the top there in the slide, we now have 20 institutional funders. That has really helped us with financing our core. So doing all this has really allowed us to set up a sustainability fund that is now sitting at 25% of our annual budget.
And 25% of a $5 million annual budget, people can do the math. That's nothing to sneeze at. It's rather amazing. You mentioned diversification as the primary risk mitigation strategy. How have you been able to do that?
So we have an overall paradigm, if you will, of looking at the 4 sectors or the 4 areas that we get money from, given that we are a charity. This helps you kind of get a picture of the possibility of further diversification than you currently have. We have the public sector or governments of 3 levels that contribute about $2 million of our total costs. We have the private sector, or that includes corporate foundations, and it also includes direct corporate grants. Then we have the community, which is a summary of basically philanthropic dollars. So dollars that are given as donations, whether they come to us through United Way or in the form of direct donations. That's the red part. And then the yellow part are the self-generated dollars at just over half, or $660,000 there. So I would ask all of you to try and figure out, if you don't know already, what is your funding wheel? This kind of wheel here. Create this wheel for yourself. I've learned over time that more than anything else, this mix of funding determines how we as organizations behave. And here's what I mean by that. What stresses us out and what leaves us cold is very much directly tied to the colors that you have in your funding wheel. I'll give you an example. If you get no money from government, you're likely, let's say you're in the US, if you get no money from government, you're likely not too worried about how the election turns out. But if you do, you most likely pay very close attention, because you know new policies will mean that your funding wheel is going to potentially get affected. I would also guess that the reason many board members don't understand for a long time how they can make a meaningful contribution is because they don't have this picture in their mind. They don't know where the real influence comes from. So you need to give this funding wheel to the board members. Then I'll give you 4 examples just to deepen people's understanding a bit and to not just have a momentum example there. These are 4 examples of other organizations in Calgary to show you what other organizations' wheels are like here. You can see that the overwhelming blue color, you can see that in one case, and that in fact is a thrift store, the yellow makes up the majority of their income. So based, again, to just make the point from before, you can guess that the organization that has the majority of yellow income will behave very differently than the organization, the upper left-hand corner, that has the majority of its money coming from government.
And so, as you said earlier, this is a long-term process.
Exactly. And so I'll tell you, or here's the picture that gives you our story. These are the key things to remember. As a not-for-profit organization, we are top-line oriented. And what I mean by that is we have to pay attention to our income. Revenues drive what we can do as as the initial business model showed with the three-legged stool. It's not the bottom line. So that's one of the things that business people have to learn when they come into our sector, is to look at the top line first. Secondly, we have to understand our revenue history over time so that we get a better grasp of what kind of a job we have done on things like diversification. So specifically this chart here, it tries to do three things. It shows that diversification over time. Secondly, it shows you the proportions. This is the big thing that I believe charts are about. They show you proportions. They can tell you whether you're talking about an item that really makes a difference at the end of the day or something that's rather marginal. And it also helps you to see where growth or decline is the most dramatic. So here's the overall challenge. I hope that all of you are successful in moving from having to pore over financial details to figure out where you're at to a place where you can have a good look at some charts and make some high-level strategic decisions based on your financial reality.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, that was a great overview, Walter. Thank you, and right on time as well. So we have lots of time now for questions and comments in the chat box. So we'll move to the question and answer period, and I'll invite participants to type questions in the chat box at the bottom right of the screen. I'll also unsync the slides so that you should be able to, participants should be able to, with the arrow keys, move back and forth among the presentation and go back and have a closer look at some of those other slides that you want to review, perhaps to formulate some questions. There was an awful lot of material covered in the presentation today, so the questions will undoubtedly be wide-ranging, but don't hesitate to post them there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One question that Seth asked early on deals with the thorny issue of language, Walter. And he said, of course, Seth from the St. John Community Loan Fund in New Brunswick, I gather you don't call it profit when you present a budget to a funder, right? We're dealing with different mindsets and different eligibility. What's your approach around language and presentation?
Right. So first of all, I'm really making a difference between what you do internally and what, in other words, what you present internally and what you present externally. This is not to hide things, but it is rather to understand. You need to have a full cost budget that to ensure that you cover all your costs. If you don't need to present the detailed line items, you don't. If you do, then you have to choose language that is appropriate for our sector. And in our sector, it's entirely appropriate to talk about a surplus rather than what the for-profit sector calls it, a profit. A surplus in the neighborhood, and here's the interpretation of the CRA. I gather Mike had a question about that earlier. You know, the whole question of what do we, as nonprofits, we are not, the public doesn't want us to make a profit, right? That's kind of the overall assumption here. The reality is, if we live hand to mouth and we start with zero at the beginning of each fiscal year, we are so vulnerable that I believe we can't offer good quality programs. So it's in our mission's interest. It's in the interest of organizational performance that we do this well. And CRA knows that as well. So there is no clear rule that you can't keep a certain amount of money. It was very interesting when we participated in charity intelligence assessments. Charity intelligence is one of those organizations that assesses and onboards charities across the country and how well, based on certain ratios, they think they are doing, not without being somewhat controversial at times, both for our sector as well as for themselves. But what we learned is that in their context, they consider a reserve fund of up to half of what your annual operating budget is as being appropriate. So what we have at a quarter is seen as a minimum there.
And so just, I guess, continuing on that thread, I'll get to Kate's question in a minute there about your self-generated revenue, but Jeff wonders, how do you educate your funders about the need for carrying forward surpluses? Because you mentioned it's essential for the organization, but you'd think it would also be in the interest of the funder to ensure that the organization's in a position to do quality, sustainable work.
Right. Okay, you're touching on two things there, Mike, in that interpretation. When we talk about carrying forward, I'm talking about a rather technical accounting term. When the money comes to the end of the when there's money left over at the end of a contract, that is a zero-based budget contract, or if you don't use it, you lose it kind of contract. You have to return the money. It'd be interesting to find out from the participants how many of you have had to return money that you didn't use up. If none of you have, then this question is not that relevant. However, I believe that organizations often underspend within their amount of time that they have to spend the money, and inadvertently not use up the entire breadth that the contract actually gives them. So in that case, I would encourage organizations to ask funders if they can carry the leftover money forward into a next contract phase to be used toward the same purpose. That way you don't have to shut the program down. It gives you a bit of leeway and so forth. Using that money and putting it straight to your bottom line, putting it into surplus, in other words, that's the second challenge. And sometimes funders will allow you to do that. I would say that federal government funders will, in general, not allow you to do that. But there are certainly foundations and other community funders that might be open to, say, if you had a staff member vacancy for 2 months and you've underspent in a certain contract, that a funder might allow you to actually use that money toward your organizational stability if you only asked. So those are the two concrete suggestions I would make in order to keep money that otherwise you might have to return, or to use it towards strengthening your bottom line.
All right. Kate asked for a bit more detail about the portion of the pie chart there which had self-generated revenues of $600,000 a year last year.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we do a number of things, and I'm not sure how relevant they are to many of you, but certainly the areas that I've already mentioned, we have about, given our reserve funds and the money that we carry forward from programs that are prepaid and so forth, we have about $2 million in the bank. And the way we have invested that generates a substantial amount, even in these low interest times. So investment policies are really important to pay attention to, that the money isn't simply sitting in the bank, not making any money at all. That's one thing that we do. We also do small things like we own our own photocopier. We've learned that funders will be happy to pay you 10 cents per copy if you have a system whereby you can track the number of copies that you sell them at 10 cents. But in order to do that legitimately from an accounting perspective, you need to own your own photocopier. So in a sense, your photocopier in-house becomes like a little business, because the number of copies or copies at the amount that we take only costs us about 3.5 cents, and if we can sell them for 10, that makes a bit of money. We also do things, we do the same thing with our office furniture. We purchase our office furniture outright, and then in those cases where the funder will allow us to charge rent for furniture, we will rent the furniture for an appropriate amount of time for the time of the project to that project and charge an amount. So basically, you're using business approaches to internally generate some dollars without having to, in a sense, and we have been called this, we operate Momentum like a social enterprise. We try to seek the paradigms that would otherwise be commonly used in a social enterprise fashion. The other areas that we make money on are we run contracts for governments, or in one case for another organization. What I mean by that is that we deliver a specific part of a service to another entity that we have a flat fee for. So in other words, we tell them this is how much it costs per person that is in this program. And when we generate the budget for that, we of course have the freedom to plan exactly based on full cost recovery, which means if we do our work to their satisfaction, we make money on those contracts. So those are the four major contributors to our yellow part on that pie chart. I hope that's helpful to Kate, I think, is who asked about that.
Yes, and so the last example you just gave is more of a fee-for-service model rather than a contribution agreement or a grant, say, for example.
Exactly, right. So, for example, we have a program, and it took us a while to figure out that we could actually apply for this kind of funding. We have a program that we have run from the beginning. We call it trades training. We offer pre-apprenticeship trades training for immigrants and Aboriginal folks, and we charge a tuition fee to the government, much like what a school would do. So they pay us a flat amount for each person that goes through the program, provided that, that they are in the program for the full duration. They take every aspect of the program, so you have to track absenteeism and so forth, provided then also that we achieve certain benchmarks of how many people are working at the end in their chosen field. And then the province basically sends us a check of the pre-agreed tuition fee at the beginning when a participant is approved to go into the program. And whatever is left at the end is ours. If we, on the other hand, we need extra staff in order to make sure that all our participants find work, then that is our risk as well. So we could potentially lose money on those contracts.
But that's the kind of RFP or competition in terms of service provision that you would provide to the provincial government, just like private sector or other large community sector groups would all bid on.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, our self-employment program, which is a program that launches the big requirement is that participants have to launch their business while they are in the program and then be working full-time in the business by the time 6 months are up. That is precisely a program where we compete against two private sector providers. And they are expecting, of course, partly the reason why they do their program, their SE program, self-employment program for the province is so that they can make some money. And we have chosen to take the same approach. Of course, in our program, our participants are folks that are that have barriers, all various forms of barriers, from people with disability to people that have language barriers and so forth. So it all fits within our mission. We don't simply offer a program to just make money. The participants that we accept into the program have to fit our overall charitable objectives and mandate.
And I guess related to that, the question Martin just posted is, how do you learn about those opportunities? Federally, there's many RFPs are posted on MERCs, right. But provincially or other places, I guess it's mostly a question of knowing the market, knowing the government, or?
Exactly. So it's a real, I think the private sector calls it business generation. So you go out there and you check out what is potentially on the market. That is, the more you're connected to those kind of opportunities, obviously, the easier it is to know when they arise. I'm stating the obvious, but it's often, particularly at a time when you set out in this direction, at the time when you make a conscious choice to go down this path of getting beyond, a zero-based budget at the end of each year, that you have to do a lot more prospecting. But I believe that it really is time well invested, and it is. But as you know from those of you that are supporting participants that are starting businesses, marketing is one of the key aspects of a successful business, and part of marketing is to research what is out there. It's not just to send out flyers to tell everybody what you have for sale. It's to actually find out who is potentially putting a contract out there in the next little while that you could bid on. So the sophistication with which you approach that has very much to do with how successful you might get at this. So MERCs is certainly a key tool that we have used at times more intensively than others in order to find out which contracts that we should bid on.
Go ahead, Walter.
The other piece that I want to add here, right at that level, I'm not sure whether any of you are in that boat, but what we've learned is that the other side of this coin involves managing growth. Often, nonprofit organizations get into this almost project addiction cycle, right, where we go from project to project to project. And in order to make sure that we manage risk, that we don't run out of money, we constantly submit proposals. And then what happens is that we get more of the proposals approved than we thought, and all of a sudden we have this astronomical growth that's really hard to manage. It may not be the case in your region or the place where you do business, but I know that that's a case for real pain in organizations that I've watched here, is when they grow too fast, you have so many other issues. So before you go into MERCs and start pulling off everything and putting out lots of proposals, make sure that you know what you're going to do if everything gets funded.
I'm struck by Lisa's comment there in the chat room about the attitude of funders she has to deal with, not only to even accept basic admin costs, and but even then struggling to push to be able to keep some surpluses. I'm just wondering, and it might relate a bit to Jeff's comment about educating funders. Do you have any more reflections about how you approach funders to try to, is there hope in changing them over the shorter, medium term, changing institutional practices like that?
I think there's, okay, it depends. I'm going to generalize here a little bit. It depends partly what level of government you're talking about. I believe that the closer to home the government actually makes its decisions, in other words, at the city or municipal level, there is more opportunity for education than if we're dealing with the feds who are sitting in Ottawa. And even if you offer programs in Ottawa, I would think that to have them change institutional practices is not that realistic. However, within the federal government departments, it is amazing how wide-ranging their practices are. I'll give you one example. The Western Diversification is our organization that does the regional development, economic development work. There are different ones across the country, and you probably know the name of yours. They are much more open to having a budget that reflects business practices than HRSDC. Part of that, I believe, comes out of their own experience because Western Diversification deals often with business contractors. They know what the business sector charges, how they have to adapt to doing business with businesses, as it were. Whereas HRSDC deals mostly, or in many cases, deals with us as a nonprofit sector, and hence their practices tend to be more restrictive. So, but researching, and this is probably why we do this at conferences in hallways, and we don't do it in public forums at conferences. Researching an individual funder's preferences or approaches to these kinds of to educate them, in other words, is very much based on knowing the people that work in that particular program area. So I would again suggest that this time well spent to, before you submit a budget, to really know who your funder is and what their practices are around letting you charge full cost recovery. We often get too quickly into putting in a budget and then find out later that the kind of budget we put forward, given the funder's restrictions, have just handcuffed us. I hope that makes sense to some folks.
Yeah, I think it, well, the emphasis that you placed earlier on knowing the funder, about relationships, building up a legitimate and credible relationship with a funder, puts us in a better position to be making the case for the actual costs of admin and building a healthy reserve for an organization, and being able to point to best practices, whether it's among other funders and other organizations across the country, really also strengthens the case. I think we're just about out of time. Just looking at Lisa's comment, she agrees. Natalie got a small amount from HRSDC, but it's definitely a struggle. I think, as Walter said, it's quite unequal across federal departments and then even compared to government. So we're just about out of time. We've covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much, Walter, for sharing the skills and insights that you've developed over so many years of leadership. I should just remind people that in addition to the recording of this webinar, which we'll make available, you'll have access to, there are also a number of articles on the webinar registration page that include one article that Walter wrote for Making Waves, or I4 magazine, that revisits a lot of the same principles and details of this presentation, along with some other sources that make the case for sustainable financial management practices. So those are good, and we'll all need to continue pushing funders and helping to educate them about the best way to support community economic development organizations. You should all have just received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. It is a really short survey. If you can open that email and take a second just to fill it out while your memory of the webinar is fresh in your brain, your feedback is very important to us, particularly because there's going to be more webinars like this one. If you have suggestions for other topics, feel free to share them with us, and you can register now for our next session. There will be a link in the follow-up email you get. It will be with the Canada Revenue Agency, who will be presenting their new guidance on charitable status for CED activities. So for all of our members who have charitable status and are interested in making sure their well within the guidelines, but also are interested in learning more about the new opportunities that CRA's new guidance just issued this summer offers, this will be a good session. So thanks again to Walter and for all of the participants who joined us here today. It was very helpful. There seems to be a few more posts in the chat room there, so we'll leave that open so that people can post any final comments or questions and share some more information. And we'll end the formal portion of the webinar right now. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a terrific day.
Thank you, Mike, for organizing it, and congratulations to CEDNet for continuing to be a great resource across the country, tying us together and giving us these common themes. It was a real pleasure doing this, and if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to get in direct touch with me via email. Mike, I'm sure, can give you that.
Yep,
those picketers.
I forgot to change the last couple of slides, but there's the, if I click this sync here, everyone should see now Walter's contact info for Momentum, and I can certainly pass on queries. And of course, those links for those articles I mentioned are still available on our website.
Great.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.